This is Duke University.
Anyway, welcome all of you all to the first FERG session here in the fall semester. And at the end, I'll tell you who some of the forthcoming speakers will be. And before we go around, before I introduce John, I'd like to ask each of you to say a few words about who you are so that John will know to whom he's talking. So why don't we start here? And I'm Joel Fleischman, and a professor here at the Sanford School, and I'm pleased and honored to welcome all of you all. Our guest speaker today, John Ettinger, is the Chief Executive Officer of the Helmsley Charitable Trust. He joined the trust in 2012. Before that time, he served as the managing partner of Davis Polk and Wardwell, a global law firm, for 12 years. And it is one of the largest and most prestigious law firms in the country. In addition, he's got very great extensive involvement in public service of one sort or another. He's been a trustee of the Phillips Exeter Academy, which he attended, as did his son and daughter. Right?
My two sons have attended.
Two sons have attended Phillips Exeter. He is also a director of communities and schools, which those of you involved in education reform will know about. He is a member of the Yale University Council and of the advisory board of the Harvard Law School program on the legal profession, and a director of the Martha's Vineyard Museum. That's a lovely place to be a director of, I think.
It's absolutely.
He's a graduate, as I said, of Phillips Exeter. Also, he was a graduate of Yale University, was a Rhodes Scholar at Merton College in Oxford, got his law degree from the Harvard Law School, where he served as an editor of the Harvard Law Review. So, very distinguished background in education and in community involvement, and is now responsible for charting the course of one of the major new foundations in the country. And it's an honor to have you here. Thank you very much for coming, John.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. And as Joel pointed out, I'm relatively new to the foundation world. And when I first was beginning to move in this direction, before I arrived at Helmsley, everybody said, and you must get this a lot, because everybody said there are two books you have to read, Give Smart and The Foundation. And I actually knew Tom Tierney a bit from a different context, but I got both books and saw your name associated with both of them. So it was a real pleasure meeting you a while back, and we've been very honored that you've said one or two nice things about some of our early efforts at Helmsley. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Having said that, I am going to shamelessly structure this afternoon to solicit your reactions and thoughts on a number of points. So I'm likely to be a principal beneficiary of this session. As Joel mentioned, I spent more than 30 years as a lawyer, both practicing and then managing at Davis Polk. And although I had served on numerous not-for-profit boards, and in that sense dealt from the other side of the table with foundations, I had never been on a foundation board. I had never worked at one. So this was a new experience. And your work has really been invaluable as I transitioned into the new role. And certainly, well, the entire industry, I think, benefits from your central and recurrent themes relating to impact, and that's certainly something that we're trying to focus on in these early stages of evolution at Helmsley. In terms of that evolution, I'd like to try and structure today talking about that evolution from three different vantage points. And the first is I've been asked to say a few words sort of by way of traditional introduction in terms of program strategies, how we think about grant making, et cetera. And then second, I want to try and give you an illustration of how we're attempting to be a learning organization. And I'll walk through an analysis that we've recently done based on our experiences in creating and supporting networks of grantees and your reactions would be extremely helpful. And then finally, I'll give you another example of how we're trying to encourage our team to think holistically about themes and analysis in philanthropy. And again, here I'm very hopeful of taking advantage of the opportunity of having all this expertise in the room. So in terms of some background about Helmsley, effectively we're in our 6th year now. We launched active grant making in December of 2008. The first grant actually, I think, went out the door in mid-2009. It's relatively large. Its current assets are between 5 and 6 billion. And we have enjoyed a very rapid and substantial growth over our first 5 years as assets have been liquidated from the estate and then moved to the trust. And in terms of the growth, and doing this from your direction, virtually everything you might, every growth curve, assets, numbers of grants, programs, FTEs, everything over the first 5 years was sort of the classic convex up growth curve. Now, though, we're beginning to enter a phase of slower growth by all of these measures. And so we're therefore hitting a form of inflection point, as it were. And one thing about all inflection points is that you're accelerating fastest just before you start to slow down. And I spent actually a lot of time at our November All-Staff, which is the meeting where we bring all the foundation together, talking about this, because I think it's particularly important from a not-for-profit's point of view, particularly a foundation, because unlike the for-profit sector, which actually tends to grow when better results, I don't know, taking EPS or something as better results, it tends to do that either through growth or exactly the opposite, shedding lower profitability operations. But generally speaking, the pattern is to spread the costs over a larger number of units, lower your average cost, earnings per share goes up. That's how you get better as a for-profit. But obviously you can't do that in a not-for-profit or particularly a foundation. And it was important that the team not continue to think about success equating that with growth, and was really more how do we get more impactful per dollar. Now, I was so focused on this that I even decided to make a joke about inflection points, and my wife begged me not to do this. She said there is, because I was talking about second derivatives and how when you hit an inflection point, the second derivative briefly goes to zero. My wife assured me, and her judgment's good about everything, and she said there is no such thing as a funny calculus joke. Please don't make it. But I did, and thanks to one or two very helpful plants in the audience, what I did was I showed a number of famous corporate slogans and logos and proposed that for the moment the Helmsley logo, it had to be the second derivative is equal to zero. The joke worked even better in that room. My wife will be very pleased that you didn't all break out into laughter, because she'll tell me once again she was right. But it was helpful in making the point, so that we had to stop equating success with more program, more dollars out the door, more grants made, and really start focusing on getting better per dollar. Exactly what that means in the context of a foundation is quite an important question, but it's a little bit of another story, so I'll leave that for some other time. We have recently finalized our programs, and we divide them broadly now into 3 areas of focus: health, which is medical research and healthcare; education and human services, which is predominantly education; and so-called place-based strategies, which are really what they sound like. They're strategies that derive or tie to a specific location or geography. So the first thing on the decision tree is, does it relate to that geography? And then the other decisions are all area-specific. And the programs under each of the categories are what you see in the slide. Now, it's, as Joel mentioned, I only joined in 2012. It's rare, not unprecedented as you know, but it's somewhat rare for a foundation of this size to launch essentially overnight. And I think the trustees did an extraordinarily impressive job of coming to consensus on initial programmatic focus and working with outside advisors to launch the programs and to really build the administrative framework of the trust. The original programs that they created are well defined. They've quickly become leading funders in their respective areas. So the type 1 diabetes program, for example, the rural healthcare program, the IBD Crohn's, those are all examples of programs that were started in this initial period. And since then, we've launched a number of newer programs. 1 or 2 programs were wound down. We've launched a number of newer programs after a lot of due diligence and learning from the experience to date. So education, New York City, biomedical research infrastructure are examples of some of the newer programs. In terms of concentration ratios, about 70% of what we do is in this area of health, as I was calling it, and that you can think of as 3 verticals, basic medical research, and then 2 disease-specific programs, type 1 diabetes and IBD Crohn's, and then a new program that we're starting in what we call biomedical research infrastructure, which is working on tools, analytics, programs, platforms, and training for advanced biomedical research across the board, particular focus on big data. And if we do all this right, we should get 2-way synergies between that program and the 3 verticals. In terms of how we work, just a few quick observations about what is very much an evolving picture. We do, in much, not all, but much of our work, we tend to swing big, to take large positions, devoting substantial resources to underfunded areas, so that as a result, with respect to these areas, we've frequently worked to materially affect the ecosystem or to seek systemic change in those areas. So our work in type 1 diabetes is probably a good example of that. This predates my arrival. The Trust did extensive research and planning. We moved quickly into becoming the largest foundation funder in that area. We created something called the T1D exchange, which is continuing to evolve, which connects patients, doctors, and researchers through a patient registry with a customized but very flexible software and a registry of unprecedented scale, also a biobank and a patient-doctor portal. There's some similarities in the IBD Crohn's story. Rural healthcare is, again, somewhat the same pattern. The rural healthcare is the portion of health that we call healthcare. Our coverage is in 7 northern Midwestern states. And much of it is done through telemedicine, or one of our major initiatives is done through telemedicine. We link more than 80 hospitals through an elaborate telemedicine network with a hub in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And through this link with this hub, we have intensivist doctors on a 24/7 basis sitting in Sioux Falls who actively participate in patient care from as far away as western Montana. And they are, through video links and through having the medical records, actually present in an electronic sense in the exam rooms and the other treatment rooms. And as some of you may know, pharmacy is a huge problem in rural areas because in the United States, a doctor cannot give you a drug in a hospital. You've got the pharmacist has to issue the drug, and there simply aren't pharmacists on a 24/7 basis or even a 9-to-5 basis on a daily basis in many of these rural hospitals. But the pharmacists are in Sioux Falls, and the legal work has been done so that the prescription can be sent to Sioux Falls. They run it through the computer. Frequently they comment on the prescription. If not, they push a button and a drawer opens in western Montana and the medication falls out. So it is, we think, an interesting program in terms of some of the changes that you need to meet the challenges of lower density populations and medicines. In terms of the methodologies and philosophic approaches to our grant making, I don't want to get lost here in the debate between strategic philanthropy and emergent strategy, or whatever you want to label those two. And it's an interesting debate, I think, in certain regards. But again, that's a subject for a whole other day. I think we are a bit of a laboratory experiment. We are purposefully not imposing a top-down methodology or a definitive grant-making model on our programs. What we are doing, and Tamara is the Director of Monitoring, Evaluation, and Research, what we are doing is creating a range of analytic tools and systems for our programs to work with as they choose. So they are, within certain parameters, free to adopt those tools or approaches to the extent and if they think they're appropriate. There are some common denominators, and I'll use two quick firearm metaphors. The first is our belief that if you aim before you shoot, you're more likely to hit something. And the second is the belief that we don't want to engage in what's called in statistics the Texas sharpshooter fallacy that some of you may be familiar with, which is that if you pump 6 bullets into the side of a barn and then paint the target, you're going to get a lot more bullseyes. In fact, you're going to get a lot more bullseyes than you really should. So in the case of some of our programs, to make sure we aim before we fire, we have built elaborate logic models and or systems models. We've calculated estimated returns on investment. We've calculated expected impact. That type of work has also led to some new perspectives in terms of metrics and monitoring and evaluation. So this is a slide that shows you, for one part of the education program, up top is how we calculated or stated what we were aiming at, the outcome and what we were monitoring to increase the number of high school graduates. Under our new model, it's by a date certain, a certain percentage of students in a certain number of states will achieve a proficiency level, which is defined on a certain standardized Common Core basis. And we have also built models, and this is taking, again, a piece of just one sort of line item in the education area. We do what I think of as cost effectiveness analysis in some of these models. It's not cost benefit analysis. We don't monetize both sides of the equation, but in terms of the benefits, we look for a common denominator over which programs can be evaluated. So for this portion of the education program, it was student months of progress over the next 3 years, measured again with reference to certain definable tests. And we were able to calculate what we predicted as the benefit, the likelihood of success, our contribution percentage to that success, and then put that over a monetizable cost, and that gave you an estimated or a predicted EROI. We also try and think about this in a portfolio sense. So you'll see the digital learning, the specific initiatives that we were looking at there didn't prove out to have, at least on this prediction, this model, as high an estimated rate of return on investment. However, these digital learning initiatives were largely uncorrelated with the other activities we were thinking of in the portfolio. So in a portfolio maximization sense, since the other 6 items were highly correlated, and if one didn't work, the other 5 were unlikely to work, we actually built in the digital learning because we try and optimize the portfolio allocation as well. So we've done this type of modeling for a number of our programs: education, a new New York program, a biomedical program. Conservation has done a version of this. We've even, in one case, taken a look at a system dynamics modeling approach, if familiar with the J. Forrester, MIT, nonlinear industrial processes modeling techniques. But a number of our other programs, although I think they are very much focused on rigorous and careful strategy development, what you call consciously strategic, it may be a less quantitative approach, but it is nevertheless analytic and it's nevertheless rigorous, and we are very committed to the notion of working out defined strategies, and then very importantly, trying to remain agile and adjusting those strategies as necessary, because that's where you get into the problem of the mapping to becoming too linear, too determinative. But we have actually created programs for monitoring all of these strategies on an ongoing basis and trying to adjust them. So despite the difference at some of the technical levels of how these strategies are done, again, a number of them take large positions, but all of them are charged with setting clear goals, taking smart risks, meaning defining what you see as the risk and elaborating on them, either analytically, quantitatively, or otherwise, monitoring and evaluating in real time, and then taking the learning from your program and your approach and trying to aggregate it with the other learning throughout the foundation, because we're a new organization and we don't want the learning to be siloed, which I think is a decent segue into the next section, if I'm okay to just keep on
Absolutely.
going. Okay. All right. So much of what we've done at Helmsley has involved working with or creating grantee networks. And in speaking with our programs just in the ordinary course of business, it became apparent to me quite quickly that a lot of that networked effort had gone extremely well, but also that a material amount had not. We had some issues on our first try. 2.0 is going to be a lot better. That was a very familiar comment. Or we're going to take a step back. That I heard many times. So even though we were very pleased with many of the results, there was this sense of we can do better, and we decided it was very important to make sure the learning didn't remain siloed, and not just that it was even discussed generally, but it was analyzed carefully. And also not that it was just an internal examination, but we also tried to take advantage of the considerable attention the networking topic has received, particularly of late in the literature. So let's just go through the inevitable definitional exercise and be clear about what we're calling, for our purposes, a grantee network. That's the definition we chose to work with. It draws on several sources. The word organization is important here. We intentionally mean to exclude networks of individuals, which we think raise different issues of scale, of governance, and certain sort of existential items like funding and governance and accountability, so that they're qualitatively different. And we also, for that matter, don't mean to cover various technology devices or networks, sort of in a Metcalfe's law type sense, except as they might apply to networks of organizations. These networks do include even loose affiliations of like-minded individuals, and I'll talk in a minute about some type 1 diabetes camps as an example of that. And they can exist even within a single institution. So we made a large grant to the Salk Institute to tie together 11 labs on a sort of Manhattan project looking at inflammation as at the genetic level as a possible source of chronic disease. And we would view that as a network that was created, even though they all existed within Salk. They were functioning as autonomous organizations, except for this networking. So yeah, I have to admit, again, being extremely shameless, that I tried to be a little intentionally provocative in my title of this. Our conclusions are not entirely contrary to received wisdom by any means. We completely get and we have benefited greatly from the power of networks, but our analysis does lead us to a few conclusions which may run counter, at least to tone and emphasis, but I think importantly so, of some of the popular literature on this point. And in particular, I think there are two major takeaways, at least for me, in our analysis. The first is that the cost side is often underestimated. Sometimes it's even ignored. More emphasis on cost does not equate to don't network. In fact, if a network's appropriate, I think it may mean spend more money, but just don't underestimate the cost side of the equation. And secondly, use networks when necessary, but only when necessary, and formalize or integrate them only to the degree that's necessary. Now, we learned a number of other important lessons, and we can go over those, but I think those were the two major takeaways. again, the benefits of networks are well established. Certainly our colleagues had examples of the positive, but they also shared a lot of examples where the collaboration had failed or it had worked, but only to a degree where they said it really wasn't commensurate with the cost, not just in a dollar sense, but imputed cost, staff time, et cetera. And there were even some instances where the networking was directly contrary to our goals. Just to take one example, we had a network where we were trying to cause certain not-for-profits to share best practices, and as it turned out, as we studied the results, it was actually our funding of the network that was allowing the organizations to remain autonomous enough that they didn't have to share best practices and didn't have to sign on. And as we brought our funding down in the network, they came together on their own because of a common shared interest, which is, again, an important part of our analysis, which I'll talk about in a minute. We found networks to serve a variety of purposes, and purpose should really inform design. We found that programs use networks in 4 ways. The first one on the bottom, the networks for grant making, those are networks which we've created to just help the trust efficiently make and manage grants. And we put this category in just to be clear with the team. Remember, this is an internal study in the first instance, to make clear to the team that it is okay to network, even if this is all that the network accomplishes. And networks of this type are generally loose affiliations. They may use intermediaries who actually organize the network, and the use of intermediaries is actually an interesting question and an evolving one, and probably this sort of subcontractor role is something we're looking at increasingly. Networks for discovery help generate new innovations. In our case, often in the biomedical research field, but it can be others. We've used them successfully in education. Networks for scale help try and take effective practices and bring them to scale across many institutions. Among other things, sometimes this results in cost effectiveness, but that's only one of the purposes of scaling. And networks for influence help organizations speak with one voice to inform policy and improve systems. We think of networks as on a continuum between loose to tight integration, and the goals here are critical. In general, and I'm underscoring in general because looser networks often are sufficient, but in general we found that looser networks are often sufficient when the goals involve learning. In fact, sometimes looser networks have comparative advantages over tighter networks in stimulating learning where greater breadth and diversity is helpful. And in general, tighter networks help grantees collaborate when the goal is not to learn, but instead to deliver on a common objective, to deliver a service. Our conservation effort in the Galapagos would be an example of that, where it was very effective when it was basically a learning operation and an informational sharing operation, but as we moved to try and accomplish specific goals more recently, we had to do a much tighter, more structured network organization. Now, the in generals I've just given you are not rigid laws, but let's say we're testing them as lemmas to see if in fact, that will help us build a broader understanding. We think of the continuum between looser networks and tighter networks in terms of 7 features. Again, in view of the time, I think the slide gives you a sense of how we're doing it. We do hope to get a better handle on whether there are combinations of these features that tell us something about looser and tighter networks for each type of network discovery, scale, and influence. So if you go back to the topology, again, remember networks for grant making were there to signal their legitimacy and encourage people to use them. You know, an annual meeting of grantees could be, which we would view as a networking exercise, could be an example. Sometimes this has evolved into a more formal, tighter network. I just gave you the conservation example, but frequently they remain loosely affiliated, low cost, low to moderate benefits for participants, low costs for us, but we have found very high benefits for us in allowing us to use our resources optimally. T1D camps, these are camps, 39 camps we sponsor for children with type 1 diabetes, is a good example of this. We bring them together on an annual basis to share results and best practices, and this type of network has far exceeded even our expectations in terms, particularly in the assistance it's brought some of the newer and smaller camps in terms of an extremely efficient way for them to learn about best practices and develop their understanding. Networks for discovery help generate new knowledge, innovative products, tools, often involve sharing of information, tools, databases. We've done quite a lot of work in this area. Maybe, in fact, it's probably the type of network we've used most. So T1D, IBD Crohn's, medical research, they all rely heavily on these networks for discovery. In terms of where these networks fall on the loose to tight scale, we found that the open-ended and early stage inquiry, not surprisingly, is frequently well served by broad and divergent thinking. So that benefits from a wide range of opinions, and loose organization is better. We may not have always gotten this one right, frankly, in some of the early stage work. But conversely, where research is digging deeper into a specific agenda, we have found a need to narrow these memberships. The smaller variety can facilitate trust, which is essential in terms of scientists working together, particularly as there are competitive elements in terms of money and publications and other resources. So T1D Research Consortium would be a good example here. We were hoping to realize some potential to stop repeating failed experiments and to bring sort of a peer review to the research planning process, but success came only when we split it up into smaller groups, because in order to get the groups to collaborate, to fully engage, and in this case really trust one another, you needed to have smaller, more tightly integrated groups. We've also found, though, that as our scientific networks for discovery become smaller and hopefully tighter, it's a not uncommon experience that they lack the necessary expertise and infrastructure to support accountability and to manage process. I think some of the scientists we were working with may have overestimated their abilities in that regard, and we certainly did, and that's an important lesson for us. In terms of scaling networks for scale, again, not always, but often networks for scaling are focused on service delivery, identify effective interventions, bring them to scale. One perhaps useful way to think about this is networks for scale try and influence those within the network to adopt certain practices, whereas networks for influence, which I'll talk about in just a minute, try to focus on those outside the networks. Tighter networks for scale harmonize practices, hone, replicate models. You can almost think of franchising models. The looser networks can help figure out what are or are not best practices. Something we did with the AAU, Association of American Universities, of which Duke is a member, is an example here. They were encouraging their members to use active learning processes for STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and math. That's an area we support. We funded the competition the AAU ran to create 7 or 8 pilot programs which would be used to begin early stage development of certain active learning processes and hopefully begin to scale them. The incentives we were offering is something we found, particularly in networks for scale, often very important. It's a way of creating a benefit to joining the network. You need something that ties it together, that makes it worthwhile to collaborate. Sometimes that can be a common goal, but often, particularly in networks for scale, some incentive structure can be very helpful. In terms of networks for influence, these are often but not always policy and advocacy. Obviously the goal is to influence people. We've probably done relatively less with this, or more recent work with this, so the results are newer. And I think our initial results are suggesting that rigorous planning and coordinated leadership is also important here. Tighter networks are thus good to deliver crisp campaigns with consistency and fidelity in a lot of places, coordinating messages, but on the other hand, looser networks can put out more ideas. But frequently you can get tensions there. So in some of in one of our network areas, for example, in education, we had a network for influence, very commonly shared goal in terms of the Common Core initiative, but the political orientations of some of the members were too different. They sort of got to the same place, but in different ways. And the only way to effectively create networks was breaking that down a little bit. I have one more topic, but I don't know if we have time.
Do we have time? Yes, he's shaking his head.
Okay, I can't see that, but good. This is to illustrate, and I'll try and move quickly here, how we try and encourage the teams to think even more broadly about some of the topics from an industry-wide relevance or that perspective. And let me begin by just asking you to look at those behavioral patterns and asking whether any of those patterns are familiar to you in the philanthropic context. I have perhaps seen some of them at Helmsley at times. Certainly I've seen them in grantee organizations that I've worked with. I've definitely seen it in the for-profit sector. There's nothing about those behavioral patterns particularly endemic to the philanthropy only perspective. But the question is, are there systematic organizing principles that underlie or explain some or all of these points of behavior? Because if there is, it would be helpful to know. Particularly because I think it's helpful that when you're working with somebody on how you want the person to behave, it's very helpful to know how, in fact, they are behaving at the current point. So it's possible that behavioral economics has something useful and quite practical to say here. And I should note that although I'm very intrigued by the theory, my aims are entirely practical as to whether it has utility for the foundation and not-for-profit world. Behavioral economics very quickly was just born out of a recognition, both theoretical and in field studies, showing that systematic behavior by individuals was really somewhat at odds with standard economic assumptions. And this was troubling because there was a time when it was, well, okay, individuals don't necessarily behave this way, one might be this way, but on average, the classic economic model is right. And the evidence really just didn't support that. Utility theory, which I'll talk about briefly in a minute, it was at the core of classic economic theory in terms of the very micro individual behavior, and it was increasingly a poor predictor based on field studies and also common sense. The mathematics, as the mathematics evolved in utility theory, that became unsupportable. Paul Samuelson wrote an article in '63 which he noted some very strange mathematical results, and actually I think the article is interesting, and you see this in sciences sometimes. Some very brilliant person writes an article and with a very strange mathematical result, but writes it off as a curiosity of the mathematics, and years later it turns out that actually that's a very important point. And this was, behavioral economists came to focus on this, particularly Matthew Rabin, who wrote a series of seminal articles which really demolished the mathematics behind classic utility theory. And since he made jokes about lawyers in one of his seminal articles, I'm going to feel free to make jokes about economists and what follows. But the first part of the work, particularly in prospect theory, for those of you who are familiar with it, focused on certain cognitive biases, the confirmation bias, availability bias, a lot of biases which are linked together under so-called bounded awareness, if you're familiar with that. And there was a seminal article by Kahneman and Tversky in '74, and I've actually seen one, and I've given you the site there, one article in the philanthropic sector that tries to look at some of these heuristics, these shortcuts by which human beings make decisions. After their initial work, Kahneman and Tversky went, and some of their colleagues went into a broader analysis of decision-making under uncertainty, and that's really the area which I think is somewhat interesting to consider. Classic utility theory, instead of using expected value, just how many dollars times what's the probability, it put in a philosophic or an emotional, how you felt, what utility do you bring to different amounts of money. And the reference point for all of this was your final wealth state. And actually, that framework was developed by Daniel Bernoulli in 1738 in a very wonderful paper. But the fact that it survived for several hundred years is probably both good and bad. Prospect theory came along. There were some attempts to modify some obvious problems with classic utility theory. Prospect theory came along as one of those alternatives, and basically it tries to make decisions with respect to a reference point, a salient reference point, not necessarily, it broke the link to final wealth states as the determinant of behavior. And in particular, the key insight was that gains are valued differently than losses, which leads to two fundamental behavioral paradigms. One, a loss is more valued or more disliked than a commensurate gain is liked. It's the so-called loss aversion. The classic example, I offer to flip a coin. Heads, I get $10. Tails, you get $10. Nobody maybe in this room, but nobody in a regular room will take that bet because you dislike the possibility of losing the $10 more than you like the possibility of gaining it. On average, people require about 2 to 1 odds there before they'll start taking that bet. Or if it's smaller than that, a great number of flips of the coin to take advantage of laws of large numbers. The other is that behavior is risk-seeking in the loss domain. You'll go for it to try and avoid a loss, but risk-averse in the gain domain. Sort of, all right, I'll settle just to lock in the gain. And an obvious example are some of the classic work that's been done on litigation settlements. I should make some joke about lawyers understanding that better than economists, just to get back at Rabin. But the litigation settlement show conclusively that people who are receiving a settlement will tend to be willing to lock in dollars coming to them, even in an actuarially unfair settlement. They'll take less than their lawyers would say, well, you've got a 5% chance of losing. They'll take a much more discounted settlement. But in the loss domain, when they're paying the settlement, people will have a tendency to refuse an actuarial fair offer, a desire to go for it. Maybe I can walk away from this with no loss. So prospect theory came along, and just so you see how seamless this entire presentation is, that curve should look familiar to you from earlier, but I promise no second derivative jokes. But actually, this curve is different, including with respect to the second derivative. If you put it on the traditional axis that prospect theory uses, value, think about that as utility or the value you accord to a loss or a gain, and then create the loss and the gain. The slope of the curve is kinked at the inflection point, so that a 1-unit loss creates more disutility than a 1-unit gain creates So the slopes of the lines are different. It's not the smooth slope I was showing you before. And similarly, the risk aversion or risk taking is manifest in the mathematics or the pictorial representation as in the loss domain, the familiar convex up curve, and in the gain domain, the concave down curve, which had been observed in quite a number of economic studies for years, but without a good theoretical underpinning as to why. Prospect theory has predicted in a lot of experiments and in some field studies, it's been highly predictive of certain types of behavior, but the question about it, and this is just a quote from one of the articles, even though Steve Levitt is a major contributor to prospect theory, they raised the question of whether in the real world, okay, flipping coins in a lab gets you one result, but does it really apply in the real world? And the article goes on to talk about some market forces which might cut against that. Nevertheless, it has in a number of cases proved to be a good predictor of behavior in the investment scenario, in the retirement savings scenario, in the health decision-making scenario. And one other among several, but one other, which is the reason for my subtitle to this thing. There's a paper done by two quite well-known economists who studied 2.5 million putts on the PGA Tour and statistically demonstrated that professional golfers who recognize, I don't know if we have golfers in this room, but these guys try and become unbelievably mechanical. Take everything out of the putting stroke you can, no variation. Professional golfers putt better when they are trying to avoid a bogey than when they are trying to make a birdie, because they frame the gain-loss as par. And this is truer on Thursdays when a professional tournament starts than on Sundays when for better, and because the framing that way doesn't make any sense. A stroke is a stroke. It shouldn't matter whether you're trying to avoid a bogey or trying to make a birdie. But they frame it in gain and loss, and they putt statistically better when they're trying to avoid a bogey. They also probably demonstrate, there's evidence that they were able to derive that shows risk aversion and risk taking. Notwithstanding, again, I don't know if we have golfers here, but the aphorism of never leave a birdie putt short, that's precisely what professional golfers do. They'll nestle it up to the hole. Don't drive it 8 feet, and if you play golf at even my terrible level, you never want to drive it 8 feet beyond when you're 5 feet away to begin with and end up with a bogey. So you sort of nestle it up, and that's what even these guys do. Whereas when you're going for bogey, they don't leave those putts short. They don't want the bogey, so they ram it at the hole. So even in professional golf, there's some indication that prospect theory may have things to say. So what might this have to say about the philanthropic context? I've given you some questions there. How does a philanthropist, someone at a foundation, frame gains and losses? You toss a coin, I know how I net it out, you know how people think about it. But how do they think about a successful program versus an unsuccessful program? Does that lead to loss aversion? I can think of a lot of reasons in this sector why it should not, but does it? Same thing about risk aversion. That might be more understandable. Sort of if we have something that's working, should we accept the good result and not press and perhaps lose the whole thing for a fabulous result? Sunk cost fallacy which would be a manifestation of some of these prospect theory heuristics. Are there other financial economic models that are relevant here or better explanations than prospect theory? I think the answer might be yes. I should say this is going to be a quick story without a punchline because I'm just starting thinking about this, and the research I've done so far and is way too small to give you. So the next slide is not going to answer all these questions. Responsibility and regret are two things behavioral economists focus on, and how does that affect behavior in the sector? And does how you handle your personal affairs, how you think about your own gambling decision-making under uncertainty, carry that over into your foundation work? That, among other things, there are agency questions, the old, it's not my money. That could cut either way, probably does. It's not my money, so I have to be very safe with it. On the other hand, it's not my money, so I'll take a chance here. Or I think I'm being told that in my sector I should or should not be more risk tolerant. And that can get into some agency effects. Again, I don't have results here. N so far is extremely small, and I also don't want to prejudice my opportunity to do some future research in this by explaining in too great detail what I'm looking at. On very small sample, I'm surprised at the degree of loss aversion I'm finding, frankly. I think there may be some other financial models that are more relevant in the philanthropic context. I'm getting results on regret factors that are absolutely the opposite of what the literature would tell you to expect. And I think, I don't know whether personalities carry over, but I think you can start to define some interesting personality types within the area of philanthropic investment. So as I say, I'm going to be shameless, and any free advice is gratefully accepted as to whether you recognize this, whether you're familiar with literature in this area, or indeed whether you think this is all nonsense and I should go back to watching PGA tournaments Thursday through Sunday. So that's a lot, and I apologize for going quickly, but those were the three perspectives that I thought I would give you on some of the work we're doing at Helmsley now.
John, thank you. That was fascinating, fascinating presentation.